Around 75,000 years ago, the human species almost disappeared from the face of the Earth, not slowly, not gradually, almost all at once. The population of Homo sapiens, a species that had already been walking the planet for over 200,000 years, collapsed to what some geneticists estimate was fewer than 10,000 individuals. Some studies push that number even lower, a few thousand breeding adults scattered across a single continent, hanging on by a thread so thin that one bad season, one drought, one disease could have snapped it entirely. To put that in perspective, there are more gorillas alive today than there were humans alive back then. The species that would eventually build cities and cross oceans and split the atom was, for a brief and terrifying window of time, rarer than an endangered animal. But here's the part that makes this story worth telling. They didn't all survive by luck. They didn't just stumble through it. There's growing evidence that one particular group in one particular place did something different, something that gave them an edge no other population of humans had at the time. And every single person alive today, all 8 billion of us, can trace their ancestry back to that group. So what happened? What pushed humanity to the brink? And what was it about these survivors that let them pull through when almost everyone else didn't? To understand the answer, we need to go back to a world that looked nothing like ours. Imagine standing on the coast of what is now South Africa, 75,000 years ago. The planet is deep in the grip of an ice age, not the dramatic Hollywood version with glaciers crashing through cities, but something quieter and in many ways worse. A slow, grinding cold that had been tightening its hold on the Earth for tens of thousands of years. The ice sheets didn't reach Africa. That's a common misconception, but the effects were everywhere. Global temperatures had dropped by as much as 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much, but it was enough to redraw the map of the world. Sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters, exposing vast stretches of land that are underwater today. Forests shrank. Grasslands turned to dust, deserts expanded in every direction, and for early humans, who depended entirely on what the land and sea could provide, this was catastrophic. The Africa of 75,000 years ago was not the Africa we know. Much of the interior was uninhabitable. Water sources dried up. The animals that humans hunted migrated or died off. Entire regions that had supported human populations for generations became wastelands. But the cold was only part of the problem, because right in the middle of this already brutal climate shift, something far worse happened. Something no one could have predicted. On the island of Sumatra, in what is now Indonesia, a supervolcano erupted, not an ordinary eruption. This was Toba, and it was one of the largest volcanic events in the last 2 million years. To give you a sense of scale, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, the one that flattened forests and covered cities in ash, ejected about 1 cubic kilometer of material. Toba ejected roughly 2,800 cubic kilometers. That's not a typo. 2,800 times the material. It was so massive that it left behind a crater lake that you can see from space today, stretching nearly 100 kilometers across. The eruption launched a column of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere that spread across the entire planet. Within weeks, a blanket of fine volcanic ash settled over South Asia, parts of the Middle East, and East Africa. In some regions of India, the ash layer was up to 6 meters deep. 6 meters. That's enough to bury a 2-story building. But the ash itself wasn't the real killer. The real killer was what happened to the atmosphere. The sulfur dioxide from Toba reacted with water vapor in the stratosphere, forming a haze of sulfuric acid droplets that reflected sunlight back into space. Global temperatures, already depressed by the ice age, dropped even further. Some climate models suggest an additional cooling of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius on top of what was already a cold world. Others suggest it may have been even more severe. The result was what scientists call a volcanic winter, a period of dramatically reduced sunlight, plunging temperatures, and failed growing seasons that may have lasted 6 to 10 years. And the broader climate effects, the disruption of monsoon patterns, the suppression of rainfall across tropical regions, may have persisted for centuries. For the small, scattered populations of Homo sapiens living in Africa at the time, this was an extinction-level event, not because the ash reached them directly, though some of it did, but because it destroyed the ecosystems they depended on. Plants died, animals starved, water sources failed, and the human population crashed. The evidence for this crash comes from an unexpected place, not from fossils or archaeological sites, but from our own DNA. In the early 2000s, geneticists studying mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down from mother to child, noticed something strange. The genetic diversity among all living humans is remarkably low, far lower than it should be for a species our size and age. To illustrate what that means, consider chimpanzees. There are roughly 300,000 chimpanzees alive today, split into several subspecies across Central and Western Africa. The genetic diversity among those chimps is significantly greater than the genetic diversity among all 8 billion humans on the planet. A group of chimps living on one side of a river in the Congo can be more genetically different from chimps on the other side than a person from Norway is from a person from Papua New Guinea. That's extraordinary. And the most logical explanation is a bottleneck. At some point in our past, the human population shrank to such a small number that the gene pool was dramatically narrowed. When the population eventually recovered and expanded, it did so from that tiny genetically limited group. And we still carry the signature of that bottleneck in every cell of our bodies. The timing lines up almost perfectly with Toba. Around 75,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years depending on the study, the human population appears to have contracted to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals. Some estimates are even more extreme, suggesting the effective breeding population, meaning the number of people actually producing offspring that survived, may have been as low as a few hundred. A few hundred people, that's not a civilization. That's not even a village. That's a single group clinging to survival in a world that was actively trying to kill them. So where were they and what made them different? This is where the story gets really interesting, because the archaeological records suggest that the survivors weren't spread evenly across Africa. They were concentrated in a very specific kind of environment, coastal zones, particularly along the southern coast of what is now South Africa, in a region stretching from the Western Cape to the Eastern Cape. Sites like Pinnacle Point, Blombos Cave, and Clay's River mouth have produced some of the most remarkable evidence of early human behavior found anywhere on the planet. And critically, the layers of occupation at these sites span the exact period of the Toba bottleneck. People were living there before Toba, during Toba, and after Toba. What these coastal populations had access to was something that most interior groups did not: the sea. While the rest of Africa was drying out and cooling down, the southern coast remained relatively stable. The cold Benguela Current and the warm Agulhas Current converged in this region, creating an unusually productive marine environment. Shellfish, fish, seals, and seabirds were available year-round, regardless of what was happening to the climate on land. And the evidence shows that these people were exploiting those resources heavily. At Pinnacle Point, archaeologist Curtis Marian and his team uncovered dense layers of shellfish remains dating to around 72,000 years ago, right in the heart of the post-Toba period. These weren't occasional meals. This was systematic harvesting. The people living here had shifted their entire subsistence strategy to the coast. But it wasn't just about food. These same sites show evidence of something else, something that might have been even more important than calories: symbolic thinking. At Blombos Cave, researchers found pieces of red ochre that had been deliberately engraved with geometric patterns, cross-hatched lines repeated in careful, intentional designs. These are among the oldest known examples of abstract art anywhere in the world, dating to around 77,000 years ago, just before the Toba eruption. They also found shell beads, tiny perforated nacreous shells selected for their size and shape, strung together into what appears to be jewelry or some form of personal adornment. These beads are between 75 and 80,000 years old. Now, why does this matter? Because shell beads and ochre engravings aren't just art for art's sake. They're markers of something much more profound. They suggest these people had language, complex symbolic language, the kind of language that allows you to plan, to coordinate, to teach, to pass information across generations. You don't make jewelry unless you have the concept of social identity. You don't engrave geometric patterns unless you can think abstractly, and you don't do either of those things unless you can communicate those ideas to other people. This is the edge. This is what separated the survivors from everyone else. Because here's what you need to understand about surviving a catastrophe like Toba. It's not just about finding food, it's about cooperation. It's about sharing knowledge. It's about being able to say to someone, the shellfish beds at the point are depleted, but if we walk 2 days east, there's a cove where the mussels are thick on the rocks, and we need to go now before the tide shifts. That kind of communication requires sophisticated language. It requires the ability to refer to places that aren't in front of you, to events that haven't happened yet, to plans that exist only in the mind. Linguists call this displacement, the ability to talk about things that are removed in time and space, and it's something that no other species on Earth can do the way humans can. The coastal populations of southern Africa appear to have had this ability, and it gave them an enormous advantage. They could coordinate hunting and gathering across large territories. They could share information about resources, about dangers, about techniques. They could maintain social bonds across distances, using symbolic objects like beads and ochre as markers of group identity. In short, they could build culture, and culture, once it exists, becomes its own survival tool. It accumulates, it improves. Each generation doesn't have to figure everything out from scratch. They inherit the knowledge of the generations before them and add to it. This is why a small group of humans on the southern tip of Africa could survive a global catastrophe that wiped out most of the species, not because they were physically stronger, not because they were luckier, but because they had developed a way of thinking and communicating that allowed them to adapt faster than the environment could change. And then once the climate began to stabilize, something remarkable happened. They expanded. Slowly at first, then in waves that would eventually cover the entire planet. The genetic and archaeological evidence tells a consistent story. Around 60 to 70,000 years ago, a small group of Homo sapiens left Africa. They crossed the narrow strait at the southern end of the Red Sea, or possibly moved through the Sinai Peninsula and entered the Arabian Peninsula. From there, they followed the coastlines eastward, reaching South Asia, Southeast Asia, and eventually Australia by around 65,000 years ago. Other groups moved north and west into the Middle East, across Central Asia into Europe. Everywhere they went, they encountered other human species, Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in East and Southeast Asia, other archaic populations whose names we may never know. And here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. They didn't just replace those other species, they interbred with them. Today, most people of non-African descent carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Some East Asian and Melanesian populations carry Denisovan DNA as well. The survivors from the bottleneck didn't just spread across the world. They mixed with the remnants of other human lineages, absorbing fragments of genetic diversity that had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in different environments. In a strange way, the Toba bottleneck didn't just nearly destroy humanity, it set the stage for the most successful biological expansion in the history of life on Earth. A single population armed with language, culture, and the ability to adapt to virtually any environment went from near extinction to total global dominance in less than 50,000 years. That's a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. But here's the thing that keeps researchers up at night. It almost didn't happen if the coastal resources in southern Africa had failed, if the shellfish beds had collapsed or the currents had shifted, if that one small population had been hit by a disease or a predator or a storm at exactly the wrong moment. The entire trajectory of life on this planet would have been different. No agriculture, no cities, no writing, no science, no you, no me. 8 billion people, all descended from a group that might have numbered in the low thousands. A group that survived not because the odds were in their favor, but because they had figured out something that no other species ever had: how to think together. There's a concept in evolutionary biology called a fitness landscape. Imagine a vast hilly terrain where the peaks represent successful survival strategies and the valleys represent extinction. Most species navigate this landscape slowly, driven by random mutation and natural selection over millions of years. But humans, that small, desperate group huddled on the coast of southern Africa 75,000 years ago, found a shortcut. They discovered that by pooling their knowledge, by communicating symbolically, By building on each other's ideas, they could leap from peak to peak faster than any species had ever done before. That's the real lesson of the Ice Age bottleneck. Not that we nearly died, but that the thing that saved us, the ability to cooperate, to communicate, to build shared knowledge, is the same thing that defines us today. Every language spoken on Earth, every piece of technology, every institution, every tradition, every song, all of it traces back in an unbroken chain to that moment when a small group of humans on the edge of a frozen continent figured out how to survive together, and they're the reason you're here to hear about it. If this story left you wanting to know more about how our ancient ancestors lived, fought, and thought their way through a world that was constantly trying to kill them, there's a video on screen right now that goes even deeper. Click it, you won't regret it.